Good morning, everybody. It is 3:57 a.m. It is bright. It's not bright. It is dark and early. It is very dark and early. I've been up since about 2 o'clock. Came in, trained, hit a 675 deadlift. Obviously not my best, but pretty good for being 3 o'clock in the morning. So anyway, so last week we talked about using the conjugate method with tactical operators, and we broke down the conjugate method into its component parts: max effort, dynamic effort, repetition effort, right? So today I want to talk about max effort. I'm going to try not to ramble too much. So max effort, whether upper or lower, is pretty simple, especially within the context of training operators, right? Pick a variation of the squat, the bench, or the deadlift, or the floor press. Again, like I've talked about in previous videos, I tend to stay away from good mornings because it's too risk heavy, and I tend not to max effort our overhead press because most of my guys don't have the shoulder mobility, shoulder range of motion to safely and effectively execute a max effort overhead press. So I just stay away from those two movements as max effort. Again, we will use them as secondary or tertiary or further down the chain movements, right? But we don't use them as max effort because I just don't think that there's enough incentive, there's enough reward based on the risk. So again, max effort, whether upper or lower, is pretty simple. Pick a variation of the squat, bench, or deadlift, work up to a 1 rep max. That's the gist of max effort. Now, there's some nuances to it. The argument can be made that for operators, and again, this is for operators as compared to powerlifters, and again, the conjugate method is very popular within the powerlifting community. A lot of people feel that it is only limited to, or that is exclusive to, or only applicable to powerlifters, which is entirely untrue. You just have to know how to navigate through the nuances and how to manipulate and modulate and modify the system and the method, the parameters, to adjust for your population. That's the same in any strength and conditioning scenario. If you're in college, knowing how to address, your collegiate athletes, knowing how to address your tactical operators, knowing how to address your fighters or what have you. Just being a savvy and intelligent coach and being aware of what's going on. So we work up to a 1 rep max. Now, the argument can be made that for operators specifically, because operators exist and perform in an environment where circummaximal bouts of exertion are required on a repeated basis. Okay, that's a lot of verbiage right there. What I mean by that is that operators have to perform at like circummaximal, so just under maximal. You could technically classify it as submaximal because it's not true max, right? But it's not like submaximal way down here, right? But at circummaximal, so close to maximal exertion on a regular basis, right? Whether it's sprinting from cover to cover, whether it's gaining an objective, climbing a wall, dragging kit, dragging a buddy, whatever it is, right? There is the demand, the need for, again, that circummaximal exertion over repeated bouts of effort. So the argument could be made that why don't we train operators by using rep maxes, like 2s, 3s, 4s, or 5s? Why don't we do that? Why do I stick with the 1 rep max? And the answer is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. And that's that I do not feel that the majority of the operators with whom I work have the technical proficiency, and this is not a knock against them, it's just that their skill set is in a different arena, right? Different sphere. Whereas I'm a power lifter, so my skill resides in technique, in 1 rep maxes, right? In maximal load. That's where my skill set lives. For my operators who exist over here on a different end of the spectrum or a different point on the line, they don't have, most of the time, some do, but most of them do not have the technical proficiency to hold on to adequate and proper posture, positioning, and technique under maximal load, right? And so think about it. If we do a 1 rep max, right, you have to be completely locked in, like let's say we're squatting, right? You have to be completely locked in, shoulders back, elbows down, squeeze the bar, big belly, all that kind of stuff, right? Good solid foundation underneath you. You have to be locked in or you're going to fail the rep, right? And that's because it's a maximal, it's either circa maximal or super maximal amount of weight, right? And so you have to be locked in, dialed in. Sorry, the TV just started talking. You have to be dialed in for that rep, right? Now with rep maxes, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, because it is technically a sub-maximal weight, I think there's the, however subtle consideration that, or concession, that maybe technique doesn't have to be held on to quite as aggressively because it is a sub-maximal amount of weight. Now, I say that, but I don't believe that at all, right? I believe that under rep maxes, your technique has to be even more dialed in, because for every rep that you do, you are incurring and you are accumulating fatigue, right? So if I squat 405 for a single rep, right, I can bang, bang, do it, done, right? If I squat 405 for 5, that's a very different story, right? Technique's gonna break down a little bit, right? I'm gonna accumulate fatigue, I'm gonna get tired, I'm gonna get a little bit, loose potentially, and I have to really hold on to that technique. And so as fatigue accumulates, technique has the potential to degrade. And what I never want to do is put my operators in a position where they're going to get hurt. Everything that we do here should be designed, dedicated, and directed toward the improvement of their physical, mental, emotional, spiritual health and well-being, and never put them in a position where they're going to get hurt. Now, accidents do happen from time to time, right? We all know that in the strength and conditioning field, that somebody's just going to get hurt at some point when you're lifting heavy weight. But I'm never going to intentionally or knowingly put my people in a position where they could get hurt, or where the chances of them getting hurt are increased as compared to a different scenario. So that's why I use a 1 rep max. You hit it, you're done with it, it's over, right? Yes, your technique may break down, but that's to be expected under a maximal load, is that at some point it's going to expose a weakness, it's going to expose, a point that needs attention, needs addressing, right? And then typically in a powerlifting setting, what you would then do is, with your secondary movement, you would then pick a secondary movement that addresses the weakness exposed by the max effort movement. Now, with the team setting, with the group setting, like I have here with my operators, I don't really have that luxury of being like, okay, hey, you broke down on your upper back on your squat, so you need to do, safety squat bar good mornings. You broke down, out of the hole, so you need to do pause squats. Like, I don't have that luxury. I don't have that time, right? So the way that I do things is we program out the max effort variation for the day. We program out the secondary variation for that cycle, and typically operate in 3-week waves. And then we program out 4 to 6 accessories. Typically, the main movement is either, again, squat, bench, or deadlift. The secondary movement is like an RDL or a good morning, or some sort of press variation depending on which day we're on, whether upper or lower. And then accessory movements are unilateral, bilateral, posterior chain, core, shoulders, all that kind of stuff, right? Obviously moving down the hierarchy as far as importance and as far as neurological and muscular demand, right? So like your big rocks are up top, which is the inverse of how it usually would be, right? If you're actually building something, you put your big rocks on the bottom, but I digress. But your big rocks are on top, and then as you get smaller and smaller, as you get further down the chain, you get smaller and smaller rocks because they're less demanding. As far as selecting variations for your max effort movements go, keep it simple with operators. Like, powerlifters need some complexity because that's their sport, right? It's lifting weight. And so you want to address certain positional limitations within their max effort stuff. So like, let's say one of my favorite examples is forward bands. I think forward bands are kind of ridiculous, but that's just my opinion, right? But I see their value. Like, if you're a lifter who tends to cave, right, whether it's a straight bar, an SSB, a cambered bar, whatever it is, if you tend to roll over and cave out of the hole, or even on the way down, put some forward bands on so that you're forced to stay in an upright posture, an upright position, right? That's addressing a specific need, a specific demand, and a specific weakness of your squat technique, which is then specific to your sport. Operators don't need that, right? That's not to say that operators don't need to be strong in certain positions, right? But what I'm trying to say is that I don't need to put forward bands on a squat bar for an operator, because I don't give a shit, to be honest. Like, we don't need to address specifically and acutely, a chest cave in the squat. Yes, do we need to address that? Absolutely. I don't want somebody to get hurt, right? But I'm not going to dedicate an entire training session to addressing that one particular flaw or one particular weakness or shortcoming. So variations are simple. I typically don't use bands that often, at least on squat. Now, squats or bands versus chains, a little bit different, right, as far as accommodating resistance, right? Bands are what I like to call dynamic resistance, whereas chains are static resistance. So what I mean by that is that because the bands are elastic and they are stretched out, they want to return to their natural shape, right? They want to turn to their natural normal length. And so they are actively, dynamically trying to compress you back down, or trying to return to their original shape. And so you, as the lifter, under load, under band, are chronically and actively resisting that load. Whereas with chains are more of a static load because they just hang, right? There's no desire to return to their natural shape, and so they're not actively pulling you down. They just weigh something, right? They just have weight to them. So I typically tend to stay away from bands on the squat bar. Not all the time. We'll use them judiciously. We just don't use them, aggressively, because most people don't have, again, the technique required to handle them appropriately. Now, I will use them, but more on a small group or a one-on-one setting, typically not with my large populations. Chains I'll use much more regularly. We will put bands on the bench bar. We will put bands. We have racks, like band pegs, so we can deadlift out of the rack, so we can pull versus bands. I will do that kind of stuff, right? But again, it's just mitigation of risk. That's what it all comes down to, is mitigation of risk with your operators. So we work up to a 1 rep max in whatever variation we choose, or whatever variation I choose for that day, or that I have programmed out. I typically program out in 3-week waves, like I mentioned. Work up to that 1 rep max, shut it down at either successful execution of the heaviest weight that somebody can lift, or at failure. Both are potentially acceptable options. Like, I'm not that coach where it's like, you don't fail, you never fail, right? Failure is going to happen. If you're not failing, you're not pushing the limits of what you can do, right? You have to find that limit, and then once you find it, you back off a little bit and adjust accordingly. And then as far as like secondary movements, again, if it's a squat or deadlift day, we'll pick either an RDL or a good morning variation. I love seated good mornings. I think they're a little bit better for lower back issues. They're not quite as aggressive because you're supported on a box as compared to freestanding in that hinge position. So they're a little bit less aggressive, a little more appropriate for the operator position or operator population. And then, if it's upper body day, we'll do some kind of, what I love to do is like rep maxes. So we'll go in waves. So we'll go like, and I got this from, I think, Tim Hensley out in Rochester, Michigan, and then the guys at Rochester Performance Gym. So shout out to you guys. Doing like 3-week waves of like 12-9-6 and then 11-8-5 and 10-7-4 all the way down to a 1 rep max in a given variation. So we'll do like close grip floor press as the secondary movement. And like week 1, we'll do a 12 rep max. Week 2, we'll do a 9. Week 3, we'll do a 6. And that just cycles back and then cycles down across 3-week waves until you arrive at a 1 rep max, right? So you're building that sub-maximal or that circum-maximal strength, that strength endurance, getting some volume, getting some hypertrophy work, and getting some technique work at the same time. And then as far as accessory stuff, that's pretty simple. Unilateral work, so like single leg, single arm stuff. Bilateral work, typically like a hinge pattern. We do lots of reverse hypers on lower days. We do lots of band leg curls on lower days. We do a shit ton of pull aparts and a shit ton of tricep pushdowns on our upper days. Because a lot of the way that I look at things is like, not only do we need muscular strength, we also need connective tissue strength and connective tissue hypertrophy, durability, resilience, endurance, and that kind of stuff, right? Longevity, right? Because that's really what we're trying to do, is not only promote performance within these active operators, but we're trying to promote longevity, durability, and resilience across a career, right? So many of these guys get into situations where their bodies are just jacked up after a career or during a career, and they hurt. They ache, they can't move well, they have limitations, they have restrictions, all that kind of stuff, right? And combat injuries are always going to happen, right? There's nothing that I can do about a combat injury. But what I can do as a strength and conditioning coach is mitigate the likelihood of an operator incurring a non-combat, non-contact related injury and help push forward or push out their longevity, extend the longevity of their career or extend the longevity of their health during and after their career. So really that's what it comes down to. So how do we make them feel better? How do we make them get out of pain? How do we make them function better, right? Those are all things we have to take into consideration. So again, max effort method, pretty simple. Pick a variation, work up to a 1 rep max, make sure it's safe. Make sure everybody has spotters, whether you're squatting or benching, make sure somebody has a spotter, because at some point somebody's gonna be like, I can handle it on my own, and they can't handle it on their own. The thing that I like to tell my operators is make sure you get a spotter before you find out you need one, right? Because I can curl a lot, but I can't curl 405, right? So I think that's about it. Thank you so much. So my last video got over 1,000 views, which for me is huge, right? I know in the world of YouTube, that's not that much, right? But for me, that's enormous. So thank you so much to everybody who watched the videos, people who have been subscribing, liking, commenting, all that kind of stuff. So please continue to do that. It helps me out a lot. And it really sort of invigorates me to continue to to continue to create content. So again, thanks for checking in, and as always, don't waste the pain.